Hey everybody. In this video, I wanted to sum up my thoughts after spending about a week with the Wild Run expansion for the crew. And I thought a fun thing to do might be to show you the things that I liked about the expansion the most, kind of in the order that I liked them, and just give you some general thoughts and impressions on what I think this expansion actually brings to the table and whether or not I think it's actually worth the $25 asking price that it's currently being sold for. And I have to say, just right off the bat, I think this is a pretty well done example of an expansion pack and how to do it right in a lot of ways. And I'll kind of touch on that throughout the video here, but let's kind of get things started off with the bikes, which for me personally are probably my favorite and the most interesting part of the expansion. There's something that they bring to the whole formula of the crew that I think really takes things up a notch and really makes the game almost kind of a new game in a lot of ways. I mean, the other specs like the drift spec and the monster truck spec and the drag racing spec definitely are great and they definitely enhance the game in interesting ways, but there's nothing that feels quite so new or different or fresh in this expansion as the bike stuff. So obviously, if you're interested in bikes and are like me, oftentimes frustrated with the way they're represented in video games, I feel like this particular expansion pack does a really good job of getting the feel and the look and the kind of essence of motorcycling into video game form. I mean, obviously, nothing is going to feel quite like actually being on a bike, but I think this game does several things really right. The key and probably most important thing that does right is the point of view and the feel of the camera angles and the way the camera pitches and turns and kind of adjusts itself as you're turning and adjusting on the bike. I think there's very few games, I think you could count them on one hand over the years that have really done bikes well, and I think this is a game that could easily be added to that list as a result of this expansion. And so that for me is the main reason why I feel like the bikes are the biggest deal or the most important thing that was added as a result of this. Now, obviously, we're also getting to see here some of the updated graphics, which came coincidentally with the expansion. But keep in mind that if you already own the crew, the physics and graphics update patch applies to the base version of the game as well. So I'm not really taking that into consideration when thinking about the value of the expansion pack itself. I'm really just looking at the things that the expansion pack brought to the table that you wouldn't get if you didn't purchase it. So while the new graphics and the new physics are awesome, and I love them both, that's something that you would have gotten just by running a Steam update on the game you already had. But having said that, I will repeat, bikes are awesome. So moving on here from the bikes, we're going to get to my next most favorite thing from the expansion, which are the monster trucks. Now, I was actually a little bit surprised by this because when I first found that they were putting monster trucks into the game and doing these stunt arenas where you'd go around and collect markers to score points, I thought, oh, that seems kind of novel, but I feel like that's the sort of thing that'll get old really quickly and maybe not have a lot of longevity to it. Man, was I wrong. There is something really inherently fun about just driving these things around these arenas and doing these jumps and loops and half pipes and all the other sort of mechanical apparatus that are scattered about these arenas to let you do all kind of crazy tricks and such. Um, I was a little bit worried that the monster trucks would feel too bouncy, and they certainly did have a little bit more bounciness in the beta. I think that's also something that got tuned between the beta and the release of the actual expansion, such that yes, the monster trucks can get a little unnervingly bouncy, especially when you're in the first person and you hit a jump particularly uh, cockeyed. But the thing is, once you develop any kind of sense for how the truck is going to handle, you can really do a lot to negate any of that weird bounciness, such that playing from the first person really isn't that big of a deal. You just have to kind of manage your throttle and manage the speed with which you hit ramps and such, and you won't have any trouble at all controlling the truck. The other kind of big surprise for me with monster trucks was how much better they made certain events that already existed in the game for me. I have personally never been a fan of scramble skill challenges in this game. I always thought that they were the weakest part of the whole skill challenge system, but there's something about doing those with monster trucks that is just incredibly satisfying and rewarding. I think it's just the fact that the collision on the monster truck is so forgiving that you can really sling it around and just go for it in those scramble situations. And also because the uh, sort of bounciness of the monster trucks has been toned down since the beta, you don't really have to worry so much about going on those on-road, off-road transitions in the scrambles. I actually think monster trucks may be even better at scrambles than the raid spec, which was my previous go-to spec for those sorts of skills. But even if that weren't the case, even if the only thing the monster trucks brought to the table was this enhanced ability to do these stunt courses and do these particular stunt challenges, and they didn't have an extra usefulness outside of that context, I would still say they're one of my favorite parts of the expansion, and I definitely get excited every time I have to go to a new summit event or summit qualifier and do the monster truck event. It's almost like a little bit of a mini puzzle, sort of figuring out how you're going to drive this truck around this arena and get as many points as possible before the time runs out. And I definitely really love and appreciate that quite a bit, and was surprised by just how much I enjoyed the monster trucks in this expansion, and how much I think they add something really kind of special to the game that it was definitely missing prior to them being introduced. I guess the other thing I'll touch on here while this event wraps up is just uh, a bit of a pointer, which is that do try to get your vehicles for each of these events unlocked as quickly as possible. You'll notice in all this footage, I'm using my good old R34 Skyline retrofitted to run all these different specs. And the key thing about doing that is that you want to make sure that you have your own vehicle as quickly as possible for doing these events, because that's actually what's going to allow you to unlock additional parts. Also, one of the things that I really love about the way the Wild Run events work versus how the old sort of story missions worked in the base game is that you can do the same mission repeatedly or the same event repeatedly and get different parts for your same spec. So rather than, say, this drag race event only giving me a suspension potentially, there are any number of parts. In fact, all of the different parts that can go on the car can be unlocked through this single event. So it really incentivizes you to keep going back through the same event, trying to get the best score possible to increase your summit ranking, but also potentially unlocking and upgrading all of the different upgraded parts for that particular spec. Now, touching on the drag racing specifically, I definitely do still really enjoy this. I don't want anybody to get the impression that because this came after the monster trucks and the bikes, I didn't find the drag racing compelling. That's certainly not the case. I'm just kind of trying to divide things up into the order that I found them, most enjoyable. But I definitely did get a lot of enjoyment out of the drag racing mini game. The way you do the burnouts, I think, is kind of satisfying and just tricky enough to be interesting. The shifting kind of mini game off the line definitely feels good, especially throwing the right stick if you're using an Xbox controller. Throwing that stick up to shift gears is something I enjoyed so much that I actually started doing it with all of my cars when I'm using manual transmission. So that just goes to show how compelling and fun that mechanic is. And then just the sense of speed and the sense of like being right on the ragged edge of control that you get from the dragster events, I think is something that really this game always had a good sense of speed, but there's something really just insane about just how fast these dragsters actually are. I mean, there are jumps that have been set up in the world now where you cannot even get to the bronze line for the jump without one of these dragster spec cars. That's how much faster these things are than anything you've become accustomed to from the game so far. And I definitely think they're a really cool inclusion and something that I very much enjoyed my time with. I do think the events being 3 run events is a smart idea, but it also makes them a little longer to play through than some of the others. So sometimes I'll kind of wait to do the drag events until I'm in the mood and I know I'm going to be good to do 3 runs. Whereas some of the other ones where it's kind of a one and done thing, I think are a little less of a commitment. But I think the drag racing mechanics are compelling enough that having to go through 3 runs to complete the event and get the reward is still totally valid. And so to wrap things up here, I wanted to talk a bit about the drift spec. And this is a tricky one for me because while I do really enjoy and like the drift mechanics that they've added to the game and the drift events that they've added to the game, I feel like this was the one that I struggled with the most. This was the new mechanic and the new kind of gameplay in the expansion that I had the most trouble kind of wrapping my head around and getting to be any good at. And it's kind of a good bad thing, right? Because on one hand, I didn't have as much fun with the drifting as I did with some of the other things, but I also am very conscious of the fact that the drifting is something that I'm going to get better at the more that I do it and the more time that I spend really mastering the nuances of it. So I think, in actuality, the drifting could end up being some of my favorite stuff in the expansion, but I'm very aware that it's going to take me time to get comfortable with it and really master it. And so that kind of gives it some longevity or gives it some legs or makes me think that maybe after I've really got a handle on all of the other new stuff that the expansion brought, the drifting might be something that I will still be working at or trying to hone and master long term. So that's kind of an interesting theory, right? That I think a big part of this expansion's goal was to give people who had already completed the story mode in the game something new to do, something exciting to do, that would keep them coming back to the game over and over again. And I think for the most part, they've been very successful in that regard. The asynchronous sort of PvP and real-time PvP that occurs in the summit events is all stuff that I see people getting pretty enthusiastic about. I've had very little difficulty finding competition, in these various events that I've been participating in, whether it's just putting down best times or best scores in these one-off events or jumping into PvP or PvE kind of crew races. It feels like the folks playing this game as a general rule have kind of embraced this whole concept of, hey, we're going to have these weekly or monthly events that everybody participates in and everybody tries to put their best effort into to make a cool competitive recurring thing in this game. Now obviously with the expansion only having been out for a week and the first major summit event having just been unlocked, it's difficult to say what the long-term staying power of this expansion is going to be. But for me personally, I found it very enjoyable and very compelling, and I can definitely see myself coming back to it over and over again throughout the course of the year, which we know for sure that the main summit event is going to last for at least a year. So basically all of these qualifiers and monthly events are going to be building up to sort of this massive competition that's supposed to take place about a year from now. And I assume will be based at least somewhat on the performance of you throughout these events throughout the year. So I guess to sum things up, I would say for me personally, this expansion was absolutely worth the asking price and absolutely worth my time, and I'm having a really great time playing it. I think if you weren't already at least somewhat on board with what the crew as a game has to offer, this expansion may not be enough to kind of sway you or convince you. But I think if you've been on the fence about the crew and kind of thinking, oh, maybe I'll be into that game or maybe I'll be interested in that game if it just had a little more content or a little more oomph behind it, I think this expansion and in particular the Wild Run and Complete editions of the game that they're now selling that include the expansion and or the season pass content all for one price are a really good time to jump into this game and a really good option to exercise if you've been kind of sitting on the crew and waiting for it to kind of fully mature as a game. I think we're definitely at that point as of now. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video. If you have, please do subscribe for more content from me in the future, and I will see you next time.